Chapter 9. The Horror Moves. "We must overtake it before it reaches the crossroads," shouted Little. They were speeding by the sea, tearing at 70 miles an hour down a long white road that twisted and turned between ramparts of sand. On both sides there towered dunes, enormous, majestic, morning stars aglitter on the dark waters intermittently visible beyond their seaward walls. The horseshoe-shaped isthmus extended to 6 miles into the sea, and then doubled back toward the Jersey coast. At the point where it changed its direction stood a crossroad, explicitly signposted with 2 pointing hands. One of these junctions led directly toward the mainland, the other into a dense ocean-defiled waste, marshy and impregnable, a kind of morass where anything or anyone might hide indefinitely. And toward this retreat Chognor fled. For hours, Little's car had pursued it along the tarred and macadamized roads that fringe the Jersey coast, over bridges and viaducts, and across wastes of sand, in a straight line from Asbury Park to Atlantic City, and then across country and back again to the coast, and now down a thin terrain lashed by Atlantic spray, deserted save for a few ramshackle huts of fishermen and a vast congregation of gulls. Chognor Fawn had moved with unbelievable rapidity. From the instant when they had first encountered it, crouching somnolently in the shadows beneath a deserted bathhouse at Long Branch, and had turned the light upon it and watched it awake, to the moment when it had gone shambling away through the darkness, its every movement had been ominous with menace. Twice it had stopped in the road and waited for them to approach, and once its great arm had raised itself against them in a gesture of malignant defiance. And on that occasion only the entropy machine had saved them. Its light Chognor could not bear, and when Little had turned the ray upon the creature's flanks, the great obscene body had heaved and shuddered, and a ghastly screeching had issued from its bulbous lips. And then forward again it had forged, its thick, stumpy legs moving with the rapidity of pistons, carrying it over the ground so rapidly that the car could not keep pace. But always its tracks had remained visible, for a phosphorescence streamed from them, illuming its retreat, and always its hoarse bellowing could be heard in the distance, freighted with fury and a hatred incalculable. And by the stench, too, they trailed it, for all the air through which it passed was acridly defiled, pungent with an uncleanliness that evades description. "It is infinitely old," cried Little, as he maneuvered the car about the base of the sea-lashed dune. "As old as the earth's crust. Otherwise it would have crumbled. You saw how the bathhouse crumbled, how the shells beneath its feet dissolved and vanished. It is only its age that saves it." "You had the light on it for 5 minutes," shouted Algernon. His voice was hoarse with excitement. "And it still lives. What can we do?" "We must corner it, keep the light directed at it for many minutes. To send it back, we must decrease the random element in it by 1 billion years. It has remained substantially as it is now for at least that long, perhaps longer." "How many years of Earth time does the machine lop off a minute?" shouted Imbert. "I can't tell exactly. It works differently with different objects. Metals, stone, wood, all have different entropy rhythm. But roughly, it should reverse entropy throughout 1 billion years of Earth time in 10 or 15 minutes. "There it is!" shouted Algernon. "It's reached the crossroads. Look!" Against a windshield glazed with sea mist, Imbert laid his forehead, peering with bulging eyes at the form of Chognor, phosphorescently illumined a 1/4 mile before them on the road, and even as he stared, the distance between the car and the loathsome horror diminished by 50 yards. "It isn't moving!" cried Little. He had half risen from his seat and was gripping the wheel as though it were a living thing. "It's waiting for us! Turn on the light, sir! Quick, for God's sake! We're almost on top of it!" Algernon fell upon his knees in the dark and groped about for the switch. The engine's roar increased as Little stepped furiously upon the accelerator. "The light! Quick!" Little almost screamed the words. Algernon's fingers found the switch and thrust it sharply upward. There ensued the drone of revolving spheres. "It's moving again! God, it's moving!" Algernon rose shakingly to his feet. "Where is it?" he shouted. "I don't see it." "It's making for the marshes," shouted Little. "Look, straight ahead, through here." He pointed toward a clear spot in the windshield. Craning hysterically, Algernon descried a phosphorescent bulk making off over the narrow of the bisecting roads. With a frantic spin of the wheel, Little turned the car about and sent the speedometer soaring. The road grew narrower and more uneven as they advanced along it, and the car careened perilously. "Careful!" Algernon called out warningly. "We'll get ditched. Better slow up." "No!" cautioned Little, his voice sharp with alarm. "We can't stop now!" The light from the machine was streaming unimpeded into the darkness before them. "Keep it trained on the road!" shouted Little. "It would destroy a man in an instant." They could smell the mudflats now. A pungent, salty odor of stagnant brine and putrescent shellfish drifted toward them, whipped by the wind. A sickly yellow light was spreading sluggishly in the eastern sky. Across the road ahead of them, a turtle shambled and vanished hideously in a flash. "See that!" cried Little. "That's how Chognor would go if it wasn't as old as the earth." "Be ready with the brakes!" Algernon shouted back. The end of the road had swept into view. It ran swiftly downhill for 50 yards and terminated in a sandy waste that was half submerged at its lower levels. The illumined bulk of Chognor paused for an instant on a sandy hillock. Then it moved rapidly downward toward the flats, arms spread wide, body swaying strangely, as though it were in awe of the sea. Little steered the car to the side of the road and threw on the brakes. "Out, both of you!" he shouted. Algernon descended to the ground and stood for an instant shakingly clinging to the door of the car. Then, in a sudden access of determination, he sprang back and began tugging at the machine, whilst Imbert strove valiantly to assist him. There came a bellow from the great form that was advancing into the marsh. Algernon drew close to Little and gripped him firmly by the arm. "Hadn't we better wait here?" he asked, his voice tight with strain. "It seems to fear the sea. We can entrench ourselves here and attack it with the light when it climbs back." "No!" Little's reply was emphatic. "We haven't a second to waste. It may mire itself. It's too massive to flounder through the mud without becoming hopelessly bogged down. We'll drive it forward into the marsh." Resolutely, he stopped and beckoned to his companions to assist him in raising and supporting the machine. Dawn was spreading in the east as the three men staggered downward over the sandy waste, a planet's salvation in the glittering shape they carried. Straight into the morass they went, quaking with terror, but impelled by a determination that was oblivious to caution. From Chognor there now came an insistent screeching and bellowing, a noise that smote so ominously on Algernon's ear that he wanted desperately to drop the machine and head back toward the car. But above the obscene bellowings of the horror rose Little's voice in courageous exhortation. "Don't stop for an instant," he cried. "We must keep it from circling back to the road. It will turn in a moment. It's sinking deeper and deeper. It will have to turn." Their shoes sank into the sea-soaked marshweeds, while luridly across the glistening morass streamed the greenish light from the machine, effacing everything in its path save the mud itself, which bubbled and heaved, made younger in an instant by 10,000 years. And then, suddenly, the great thing turned and faced them. Knee-deep in the soft mud it turned, its glowing flanks quivering with ire, its huge trunk malignly upraised, a flail of flame. For an instant it loomed thus terribly menacing, the soul of all malignancy and horror, a cancerous cyclops oozing fetor. Then the light swept over it, and it recoiled with a convulsive trembling of its entire bulk. Though half mired, it retreated swayingly, and its bellows turned hoarse gurglings, such as no animal throat had uttered in all Earth's aeons of sentient evolution. And then, slowly, it began to change. As the light streamed over and enveloped it, it began unmistakably to shrivel and darken. "Keep the light steady," Little cried out, his voice tremulous with concern, his features set in an expression of utter revulsion. Algernon and Imbert continued to advance with the machine, as sickened as Little was by what they saw, but supported now by the disappearance of all uncertainty as to the truth of Little's claims. And now that which had taken to itself an earth form in aeons primordial began awfully to disincarn, and before their gaze was enacted a drama so revolting as to imperil reason. A burning horror withdrew from its garments of clay, and retraced in patterns of unspeakable dimness the history of its enshrinement. Not instantly had it incarned itself, but by stages slow and phantasmal and sickening. To ascend, Chognor had had to feast, not on men at first, for there were no men when it lay venomously outspread on the earth's crust, but on entities no less malignant than itself, the spawn of star-births incalculable. For before the earth cooled, she had drawn from the skies a noxious progeny. Drawn earthward by her holocaust they had come, and relentlessly Chognor had devoured them. And now, as that which had occurred in the beginning was enacted anew, these blasphemies were disgorged, and above the dark rack defilement spread. And at last, from a beast shape to a jelly, Chognor passed, a jelly enveloped in darting filaments of corpse-pale flame. For an instant it moved above the black marsh, as it had moved in the beginning, when it had come from beyond the universe of stars to wax bestial in the presence of man. And then the flames vanished, and nothing remained but a cold wind blowing across the estuary from the open sea. Little let out a great cry, and Algernon released his hold on the machine and dropped to his knees on the wet earth. Imbert, too, relinquished the machine, but before doing so, he shot back the lever at its base. Only for an instant did the victory go unchallenged, for before the spheres on the machine had ceased to revolve, before even the light had vanished from the gleaming waste, the malignancy that had been Chognor Fawn reshaped itself in the sky above them. Indescribably it loomed through the gray sea mists, its bulk magnified 1,000-fold, its long, dangling trunk swaying slowly back and forth. For an instant it towered above them, glaring venomously. Then, like a racer, it stooped and floundered forward, and went groping about with its monstrous hands for the little shapes it hated. It was still groping when it dimmed and vanished into the depth of the hazy, dawn-brightened sky.